EverQuest. You know, EverQuest has got to be on my top 5 list of most influential games of all time. I'm not just talking about most influential MMORPGs, I'm talking about all games, all time, top 5. EverQuest is definitely on that list. The influence of this game is obviously felt in the MMO genre. You can still feel it today, but it's also felt everywhere else. I don't think that you would have games like Dragon Age Inquisition or even The Witcher 3 look and feel the way they do today without EverQuest. But of course, EverQuest was also influenced by what came before it. And while it was an instant hit on its release in 1999, it was very, very close to getting canceled the year before it came out. All right, let's start at the beginning. It's 1993 and John Smedley's employer, Park Place Productions, has gone belly up after failing to meet payroll. Smedley's been working on games for a few years now, mostly for a company he founded, Night Technologies, which he sold to Park Place. Night Technologies' most high-profile project was a port of Double Dragon to the Atari Lynx. Smedley needed a job, so he went straight to the source. Park Place Productions was working with Sony on sports titles before it went out of business. He, along with other Park Place developers, including Russell Shanks and Andy Zaffron, approached Sony about creating a new studio out of the remains of Park Place. The company agreed, creating Sony Interactive Studios America in late 1993. Smedley managed development of games linked to Major League Baseball and the National Hockey League, like NHL Face-Off. But there was just one little problem with this, and that was he didn't like sports games. In an interview for the book Gamers at Work, The Stories Behind the Games People Play, Smedley said, quote, "Let me tell you, I hate sports games. I despise them." Smedley, like a lot of game devs, was a nerd at heart. He'd played Dungeons & Dragons growing up, and his early attempts at programming were mostly D&D character generators. He was also nursing an addiction to early multiplayer games like Cyberstrike. This is before the World Wide Web, remember, so online games, well, they charged by the hour. Smedley once racked up $600 in access charges over just 1 month, playing only Cyberstrike. Smedley, he wanted to do what every game dev wants to do. He wanted to make a game he wanted to play. So he pitched the idea for an online D&D style game to his boss, Rich Robinson, in 1994. But Robinson said no. You see, online RPGs existed in 1994. Early examples like Island of Kesmai and Neverwinter Nights were pretty popular for the day, but their reach was limited compared to console games. Besides, Sony was all hands on deck for the PlayStation, a console that wasn't built with online play in mind. Why would Sony make an online RPG for PC gamers? It just didn't make any sense to Robinson. As the saying goes though, if at first you don't succeed, try again. Smedley did just that when he found himself with a new boss, Kelly Flock, in 1995. Flock was more receptive to the idea, and when Smedley came to him with a budget of $800,000, Flock said, "Hey, what the hell?" That's not what he actually said, but something like that. The project was given to Smedley on top of his other responsibilities, and at this point in his career, he was really more manager than he was developer or coder. If he was going to make the project a success, he was going to need a team. So he did what you did when you were looking for aspiring game developers in 1995. He hit the shareware scene.
Welcome to the Computer Chronicles. I'm Stuart Chaffee, and this is Gary Kildall. Gary, as you can see from all these books here, there are literally thousands of programs you can get for nothing or for a very small contribution. This program here on the computer...
Shareware was a popular way to sell PC games in the mid-90s. It was essentially a demo available on CD or in the late 90s online. Now usually the demo ended at a specific level or after a certain amount of time and asked for payment to continue. Shareware was used by even the largest publishers. They'd often distribute shareware demos on discs included in popular PC gaming magazines like Computer Gaming World and PC Gamer, among many others. But implementing shareware was simple, so pretty much anyone could do it. Brad McQuaid and Steve Clover were small players in the shareware scene. The pair, who attended college together, worked as Unix database programmers during the day and crafted their game War Wizard at night. War Wizard's 1993 debut wasn't a huge hit, selling only 1,500 copies direct to the gamers. While McQuaid once told IGN that he and Clover were, quote, approached by a couple publishers, the game was never picked up. Undeterred and now working a day job, creating accounting software for Flynn Rainbow Nursery, as in plants, the pair cranked out a demo for a sequel. It was also a resume. The demo, released for MS-DOS, booted with a screen that included McQuaid's phone number and email address. The demo credited not only McQuaid and Clover, but also 3 artists: Kevin Burns, Victor LaFica, and Bill Trost. The demo did its job. It got Smedley's attention, and as luck would have it, Smedley worked with Milo Cooper, a friend of McQuaid's, who did the art for the original War Wizard, although not for War Wizard 2. Smedley offered McQuaid and Clover a job working on what McQuaid would later recall as being pretty much a graphical online multi-user dungeon. And I mean, that was pretty much their dream job, right? So they eagerly accepted, and they joined Sony in March of 1996. Smedley's idea was rather vague. He didn't have a clear design vision or even a name for the game. McQuaid and Clover, they went right to work, drafting a document that outlined the game's core gameplay and lore. Clover dreamed up the name EverQuest on his morning commute. The design document, later enshrined in the company's office, is where the game really started to come together. The design document also really passed the torch from Smedley, who'd continued to be the project's manager, to McQuaid, Clover, and the rest of the team that was starting to form. Now, you might think hiring for a cutting-edge RPG would be easy, but EverQuest, it was anything but a sure bet. It was still early days for the internet after all.
Hey Dan, ready for the game? I'm just finishing up here with my new kayaking friends.
Kayaking friends on your computer?
Yeah, I just got America Online.
In an interview with PC Gamer, McQuaid said the team's efforts to recruit developers with experience working on pay-per-hour online games, like Smedley's beloved Cyberstrike, were generally rebuffed. The quote, he said, "We wanted to bring those people in because they were the veterans of the day. They had the most commercial online experience. They laughed at us and said we were crazy." Instead, the team turned to personal contacts and local colleges to recruit enthusiastic but inexperienced talent. Really, people on the same wavelength as McQuaid and Clover. Bill Trost and Kevin Burns, 2 of the artists credited on the War Wizard 2 demo, joined first as part-time testers, later becoming full-time members of the team. Another recruit, Rosie Rappaport, joined after landing in the same bullpen as McQuaid and taking an interest in EverQuest's early development. Other early additions included Jeffrey Zatkin, credited with guiding the design of EverQuest's game world, Russ Shanks, a programmer at Sony ImageSoft who by the time of the game's release would rise to the rank of COO, Doc Whitson, who took charge of character art and the UI, and Roger Uzon, who worked on zone and world server design. While the team grew in 1996, it did remain a side project packed in a small office nook meant for just 4 people. EverQuest, designed only on PC, was funded by Sony Interactive Studios, a studio making sports games for the world's most popular game console. Rappaport told PC Gamer that devs working on the studio's sports titles gave the RPG a nickname, NeverQuest, and said the EverQuest team was jokingly called the, quote, Ghouls and Goblins guys. Now Smedley, he tried to keep the project off the radar, and that's a task that he eventually failed. But we'll get to that. The early development of EverQuest, which included a draft of the world, character art, and the creatures that would inhabit the world, took inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game. Smedley, McQuaid, and Tross all loved the pen and paper role-playing game, and sometimes referenced personal D&D campaigns by naming EverQuest characters after their own D&D characters, or the characters of friends. The connection between Dungeons & Dragons and EverQuest is, I think, extremely clear, although if you have only played more modern versions of D&D, you might not quite see it. Modern D&D is fairly flexible, letting players pick from a variety of race, class, deity, and background options without significant restriction on what the resulting character can do. D&D's 2nd edition, the version out prior to EverQuest's release, however, that was a bit of a different story. Take D&D's alignment system, which required characters to pick from one of 9 alignments. The alignment you had picked had a lot of consequences. The Paladin class, for example, was restricted to human characters in D&D's 2nd and 3rd editions, and Paladins had to be lawful good, according to the player handbook rules at least. There was a lot of examples of this in D&D 2nd edition where the alignment and the race and the class had to come together in certain ways, and if that wasn't what you wanted to play, well, tough luck. That's just what you had to go with. Those ideas are actually really heavily mirrored in EverQuest's character creation. The team imagined EverQuest as a game that, like Dungeons & Dragons, was built around strict rules of race, class, and alignment, although it was slightly less restrictive than D&D overall. The Paladin, for example, could be played by one of 5 races, offering a bit more flexibility. Still, all EverQuest characters had an alignment, good, evil, or neutral, and good and evil characters were typically kill on sight to non-player characters of the opposing alignment. There were also restrictions on the alignments particular races and classes could choose, creating a division between good races like humans and dwarves and evil races like dark elves and trolls. Now, character class was a key part of the design in EverQuest, defining the character's stats, abilities, spells, and the equipment they could use. And also, like early versions of D&D, there wasn't a whole lot of room for customization in the game. A fighter of a given level was mostly the same as any other fighter of that level. While D&D started to expand customization throughout the 1990s, most options were still in supplemental books, such as the Player's Option books, which started to appear in 1995, just 1 year prior to EverQuest's development. All in all, I think it's pretty easy to see the connections between EverQuest's race, class, and world-building choices in Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. But it wasn't the only inspiration. McQuaid, in particular, was a huge fan of multi-user dungeons, or MUDs. Now, MUDs were multiplayer games, though we wouldn't call them massive today. An active MUD might have a few hundred simultaneous users tops, and user counts in the dozens were a lot more common. They also had, in most cases, an important limitation that's going to seem really weird by modern standards. They were all text-based. Players interacted with the game by reading text and then inputting text commands like left or open bag. They could also chat and interact with other players, again, all through text. Now, this gave MUDs a very particular feel. They weren't just the games, but a cross between an RPG and an IRC chat room. Fun and frustration was often found with other players and not from a raid boss or a tough dungeon. The EverQuest team's love of MUDs translated to the game's gameplay and design. While it is a fully 3D game with a large world, there frankly just isn't a lot going on in EverQuest, at least not as it was launched in 1999. Now, what I mean is that the game had a lot of empty space. Combat was slow. Recovery from combat was slower still. Gameplay was all about approaching and interacting with objects in the game world by either clicking on them or entering text commands. Text commands and text buttons dominated EverQuest interface at release, pushing the game's attractive 3D graphics into a limited perspective that took up only about a third of the screen. Now, the game had dozens of text commands used to accomplish most tasks in the game, from observing enemies to determine their threat level to joining the group or opening a spell book. Buttons that you could create were often just macros automatically executing a desired text command in the chat window. It is kind of a strange way to interact with a 3D game. EverQuest's similarities to early MUDs were so deep that a simple turn of phrase caused a minor meltdown among some fans of DQ MUD, a popular example of the genre. Bernard Yee, director of product development on EverQuest, gave a presentation in 1999 at the Replay conference, and he said EverQuest was based on DQ MUD. Now, Yee meant it was an inspiration, but some MUD fans took it literally, starting rumors that EverQuest actually used DQ MUD code in its game engine. This is a pretty clear example, early example, of the internet rumor mill running amok. The original accusation seems to be linked to a single post by someone who attended Yee's presentation but doesn't even directly quote Yee in any way. Still, some DQ MUD fans repeated the rumors, and they did so, well, rather aggressively. Eventually, McQuaid would sign a statement disavowing any connection between EverQuest and DQMud's source code on March 17th of 2000, and that pretty well closed the matter. But it does go to show just how much similarity was seen and recognized by players of MUDs at the time. Now, this all doesn't mean that EverQuest was just a derivative, however, or lacking things to do. On the contrary, McQuaid led development with a content is king mindset. EverQuest had distinct progression both in character development and in how players explored the world. In a 2011 interview published on MMORPG.com, McQuaid said the team, quote, wanted there to be compelling content all the way from level 1 to 50. Having lots of races, classes, items, zones, etc. was always the plan. This was so revolutionary that it seems rather mundane in retrospect. Today, players just expect games to include all kinds of ways to progress, from leveling up, to exploring all kinds of new areas, to getting a wide variety of new items to equip their characters. And this applies to a really broad range of genres. But that isn't how most games were designed prior to EverQuest. The idea of progression on a massive scale across a massive world was relatively new. Ultima Online is the perfect counterpoint. Now in that game, players could improve character skills through repetition, and some items were certainly better than others, but a fully equipped and highly skilled player was not immune from even mundane enemies, particularly other player characters. Ultima Online and the other early MMO, 1995's Meridian 59, relied on player versus player combat to challenge experienced players, a concept that carried over from PvP-centric MUDs. The EverQuest team, however, focused on cooperative play that pitted adventurers against dangerous open-world monsters across a wide variety of difficult dungeons. McQuaid said, quote, we'd played PvP MUDs in the past, and we were not fans of them. EverQuest did decide to offer a few PvP servers, and players could choose to voluntarily duel each other on any server, but cooperative play was definitely the focus. Now these key concepts, constant progression and cooperative play, are hallmarks of EverQuest design, and those ideas really set the game apart from anything else that came out in the late 90s. No other game on the market played quite like EverQuest, and most successful MMOs would eventually come around to its ideas. Yet, despite all of this, its road to release was anything but smooth.
For within each shattered remnant of the jewel dwelled a perfect likeness of Sosaria. Thus is the world in which you are born, live, and die. Britannia, that was once Sosaria, now exists as 1,000 worlds, each with its own peoples, history, and destiny.
The launch of Ultima Online on September 24, 1997 carried the famous Ultima franchise into online gaming. Developed by Superstar Studio Origin Systems and produced by amateur astronaut and veteran game developer Richard Garriott, Ultima Online put massively multiplayer gaming on PC Game Magazine covers worldwide. Like EverQuest, Ultima Online was a shot in the dark. Electronic Arts estimated it would perhaps hit 15,000 subscribers. Instead, it became EA's fastest-selling PC game up to that point. It was an international success too. Early shipments to Japan and Europe, they sold out the day they hit the store shelves. The game hit 70,000 monthly subscribers by the end of 1997, and its upwards trajectory would continue for years. This was a big deal for the EverQuest team. According to McQuaid, the release of Ultima Online, quote, gave us the confidence that an MMORPG could be commercially viable. But Ultima Online's success hadn't changed a fundamental problem that hounded the game's development from the day it started, something that we've already brought up several times in this video. EverQuest just didn't fit with Sony's long-term goals in the video game industry. Sony had bet big on the PlayStation, and it won. It cleaned up. It was the dominant player in the console at this point, and the console's further success shifted the company's focus even more towards console games. Now, Sony Interactive Studios America was relabeled 989 Studio in April of 1998, and it was tasked with creating sports games for Sony's second console, though the studio did end up making a few PlayStation games in other genres like Siphon Filter and Twisted Metal 3. Flock couldn't continue to justify EverQuest, which had exceeded its original $800,000 budget by A lot. Smedley pegged it at $4.5 million 3 years into the project. EverQuest was canceled. Except obviously it wasn't. You see, Flock couldn't really justify continuing to fully fund the project, but at the same time, he didn't ask the EverQuest team to turn off their workstations and hand over the hard drives. Flock told Smedley that they could continue to develop the project as an independent company. 989 Studios would foot half the bill in exchange for a share of the newly formed studio. All Smedley had to do, just all he had to do, was come up with the other half of the cash needed to complete the project. This led to a whirlwind of meetings with potential investors throughout 1998 that came to a pretty strange conclusion. Sony funded the other half of EverQuest. But it wasn't 989 Studios. Instead, the money came from another division of Sony called Sony Online Entertainment. This was a new division of Sony that existed exclusively to make online games. At the time, they operated the now mostly forgotten Station.com, which really just offered a selection of casual games that people could play online. EverQuest didn't fit into the plans of 989 Studios, but it fit pretty well into the plans of Sony Online Entertainment. So Sony, after deciding not to complete the funding of EverQuest, decided to complete the funding of EverQuest, just not in the way that anyone had originally intended. With funding secure, Smedley, McQuaid, and the rest of the EverQuest team founded Variant Interactive on January 1st, 1999. Well, actually, the studio was briefly known as Red Eye Interactive, but it turned out that name was taken, so Variant Interactive it was. The entire 56-person team made the leap from 989 Studios to Variant, even Smedley's assistant and the IT guy. In the end, it seems to have been a smooth transition, the kind you rarely hear about today in the game industry. The shift from 989 Studios to Variant Interactive didn't set back development of EverQuest significantly and gave the studio the funds to finish the game. EverQuest hype started to reach the eyes of PC gamers in December of 1997 when Computer Gaming World published a short preview headlined "Sony Goes Deep." Set to target a mid-98 release window, the CGW article highlighted the game's attractive 3D graphics and a long list of character classes. PC Zone and Computer and Video Games magazine published their own brief teasers, though they had few details. A beefier preview appeared in the March 1998 edition of Australian game magazine PC Powerplay. It described EverQuest as having, quote, Quake-like graphics and a truly deep online RPG, and it praised it for having, quote, probably the best graphics seen in an RPG. Now the article says that EverQuest has a Diablo-esque interface, and also says the combat is strategic and complex, which honestly, those didn't end up being great early evaluations of what EverQuest actually became. It projected a spring 1998 release date, and given that EverQuest wouldn't come out for another year, that was pretty optimistic. But the hype didn't just arrive through the traditional game magazine puff pieces. McQuaid ran a grassroots marketing campaign, reaching out to various bulletin boards and forums dedicated to MUDs. He was, after all, a longtime player, and he had roots in these communities. It was effective, despite the slim coverage in the press as of early 1998, and a lack of marketing from Sony up to that point. EverQuest's earliest fans started to talk about the game online. EverQuest Express, which called itself an online paper, popped up in early 1998. That was followed by EQ Vault later that same year. These fan sources started to discuss their hopes for what EverQuest would be, and they also started to speculate about when a beta might appear. The beta, which began in late 1997, started with an exclusive group. While it was an online game, websites were still an up-and-coming way of distributing material, and the EverQuest team wasn't confident it could distribute the early beta phases online reliably. The earliest beta testers who took part in Phase 0.5 and Phase 1 beta testing were interviewed over the phone by the EverQuest team and then sent a physical disc. Even Phase 2, held in early 1998, was still very small, with only 100 testers selected, though at that point the team was no longer interviewing the testers over the phone. I've never found any confirmation on how many people applied to the beta, but fawning newsgroup postings suggest that for fans, obtaining an EverQuest beta invite was a lot like winning the lottery. McQuaid and other members of the team, such as Bill Trost, kept up community hype by hosting a series of chats. They were very 1998, taking place in the IRC with, as far as I can tell, very minimal moderation. The questions bounced between serious discussions of mechanics like should the game have fast travel, to those that would get canceled today, like how big will the female character's breasts be. It was a bit of a shit show, honestly, but one that effectively engaged die-hard fans of early online gaming. The early hype gained official recognition at E3 1998, which was held in Atlanta, Georgia. EverQuest became a surprise hit. McQuaid had the opportunity to demo the game for some of his personal heroes, including Richard Garriott of Ultima fame. More importantly, for the game's reputation at least, EverQuest won several awards, including the Best of E3 Game Critics Award for Best Online-Only Game. Around this same time, in the June 1998 issue of PC Game Fan, EverQuest received its biggest preview yet, a full 2-page spread. Like earlier previews, it touched on the features that set the game apart from Ultima Online or Meridian 59. It boasted a long list of class and race options, over 40 skills, hundreds of spells, and also noted the lack of PvP combat. But the real focus, and what was becoming a trend for these previews, was the game's graphics. This is the first preview I'm aware of to state hardware 3D acceleration would be mandatory for the game, and that was a big deal. It meant most PC gamers would have to buy new hardware to play EverQuest, but it also underscored how the game's advanced 3D graphics were in a different league from Ultima Online, which was an entirely 2D title. The EverQuest beta got serious attention in the fall of 1998. Phase 3 started in November, and that opened the game up to 4,000 testers. It was a huge leap up from the previous betas, and a promising number. After all, the MUDs the game was based on often had no more than a few hundred simultaneous players. This was followed up by the Phase 4 beta in February of 1999. That included an incredible 25,000 players, which, despite the size of this beta, still received a physical disc in the mail, plus a letter from Brad McQuaid. With this beta underway, the team had every reason to think EverQuest had connected with its core audience. Through its multi-year and uncertain journey, EverQuest's vision remains singular. Smedley, reflecting on McQuaid's work, in a piece posted to the New York Video Game Critics Circle's website, remarked that, quote, EverQuest ended up being 100% what was in that doc, referring, of course, to the original EverQuest design document. There was no big swerve in the project's course, no major rethink of either theme or execution. The studio kept its talent too. Smedley, McQuaid, Tross, Clover, Burns, Rappaport, Shanks, and Zatkin, they all saw the project through from its early days. Now, it was time to put the game they'd spent years working on in front of the unmerciful gaze of paying customers. EverQuest launched on March 16, 1999, and it immediately beat expectations. Over 100,000 copies moved on the first day, and that would increase to 225,000 after 6 months. As a result, EverQuest faced the problem that plagues online games to this day: launch issues. Yep, it was a bit of a mess. Many players couldn't connect at all, and those that did often faced random disconnects or excessive lag. The problem, as McQuaid would tell it, was not the design or the number of Sony's servers, but actually limitations of the early internet. The game's launch servers were all in San Diego, and the local internet infrastructure couldn't handle the sudden flood of information. McQuaid told MMORPG.com, quote, "The millions of tiny packets were too much for routers to handle at the time." In apology, Sony Online Entertainment credited all players with 2 weeks of free game time for their trouble. Despite this, EverQuest received plenty of praise. Computer Gaming World called it, quote, "damn addictive and fun." PC Accelerator agreed, giving it a 9 out of 10 and saying, quote, "It came down to a score based on the fact that in the middle of deadline week, I stayed up until 3:30 a.m. one night and 5 a.m. the next to keep playing." Next Generation magazine gave it a rare 5-star review, saying, quote, "The newest high watermark by which all future persistent online worlds will be judged." There were some critics, though. Scott Jennings, better known at the time as game blogger Lum the Mad, was among the game's more vocal opponents, railing against its many restrictions, from the leveling system to lack of open PvP combat to the restrictions on what players could or could not name their characters. The flame wars over many of EverQuest's design choices lasted for years. Despite its success, you might be surprised to learn that EverQuest didn't end up on the top seller charts for 1999 or the year after its launch, even if only PC games are considered. It was beat out in raw copies sold by numerous titles, from SimCity 3000 to Age of Empires 2 and Baldur's Gate. This perhaps is not too surprising, and not only because EverQuest was still on the bleeding edge of the massively multiplayer genre. It's also a game that, as mentioned, required a very beefy system to run, including a 3D graphics accelerator. It was a new IP from a new studio, funded by a publisher that didn't really expect the game to boost its bottom line. But that's part of why the success of EverQuest caught the attention of the entire gaming industry. EverQuest wasn't a massive bestseller, but it made money hand over fist because players who stayed continued paying month after month. That payment went directly to the game's creators without giving a cut to the retailer. And while the game moved fewer copies than best-selling titles, the players were loyal. Even if they left for a time, they were likely to return when a new expansion appeared. Publishers were soon falling all over themselves to launch their own take on this new business model. The result was a horde of new MMOs over the next decade. Not just EverQuest 2 and World of Warcraft, but also Anarchy Online, Dark Age of Camelot, The Lord of the Rings Online, Star Trek Online, City of Heroes, Warhammer Online, Final Fantasy XI, Dungeons & Dragons Online, and many, many others. Even single-player games started to mimic gameplay ideas EverQuest made popular, a trend that started with games like Final Fantasy XII and Xenoblade Chronicles, though it didn't become well recognized in the West until the release of games like Kingdoms of Amalur and Dragon Age Inquisition. The entire open-world genre owes a debt to the design of EverQuest, a game that proved the appeal of constant progression, exploration, and advancement in a large virtual world. And while today's mainstream gaming culture has largely moved past EverQuest, as evidenced by the failed attempt to resurrect it with EverQuest Next, it'd be wrong not to acknowledge the ongoing development of both EverQuest and EverQuest 2. Both games still have a small but loyal player base today, and both games receive regular expansions. Or if you want the more old-school experience, you can always check out fan-hosted servers like Project 1999, which largely recreates the experience of the original EverQuest in its first two expansions. Here again, I think EverQuest has proven itself a leader. The success of Project 1999, including the legal blessing of current EverQuest IP owner Daybreak Games, proved that retro online gaming has its niche. Today, many older MMOs have legacy or progression servers that reintroduce the original content, a trend that culminated in Blizzard's decision to launch World of Warcraft Classic. Even today, 20 years after release, EverQuest still finds ways to lead the game industry forward. Now, before I wrap up here, I want to talk briefly about the loss of Brad McQuaid, who unfortunately passed in his home in November of 2019. I think his unexpected death really underscores why it's important to remember games of the past, as well as remember the people who made them. Time never stops. The people who make games and the people who play them, they're not getting any younger. And despite the alleged permanence of digital information, I think we're finding it's actually surprisingly easy to lose records of online games in particular. I'm pretty sure there's chunks of the original EverQuest forums, as well as fan sites that are just lost for good. Even EverQuest, in its original form, barely clings to existence through Project 1999. So, let me know what you thought about this video. Let me know if you have any ideas for topics I might cover in the future. And of course, let me know if you have any insights into obscure EverQuest information, such as maybe some of those fan sites that I mentioned no longer seem to be live or archived on archive.org. I know there's still a lot I could cover here, from the ever-crack moral panic that followed the game's success, from the weirdness surrounding the game's first raids, or perhaps the long and meandering history of expansions. And of course, if you liked this video, give it a like. If you loved it, please subscribe. You'll see more videos like this in the near future. And with that, thanks for watching, and see you next time.